Eilish Ferran. I'm the Provost of the Gates Cambridge Trust, and it is my very great pleasure and privilege to welcome you here to our 2024 annual lecture. This is going to take the form of a conversation among our distinguished speakers, and will then open out to a Q&A, and we very much encourage questions from the audience. So for those of you who perhaps have not come across the Gates Cambridge program before, it is a program that funds scholars from around the world to study for postgraduate degrees, both masters and PhDs at Cambridge. At any one time, there are about 250 Gates Cambridge scholars in residence in Cambridge. Scholars hold the title for life, and there are around 2,000 scholars around the world now. We've been in existence for 24 years, looking forward to our 25th next year. The scholarship is distinctive in a number of ways, including that as well as academic distinction as one of its criterion, it also has a criterion of a motivation to improve the lives of others. I'm in my second year as provost, and what I have discovered is just that depth of commitment that our scholars have to making a positive difference in the world. As we said when we launched our podcast series earlier this year, Gates scholars bring ideas, vision, and optimism about how we can make a difference practically in tackling some of the world's most complex and challenging problems. Those are words that could also be said to apply to our three distinguished speakers, one of whom himself is a Gates alumni scholar. A review of their book, Permacrisis, in the New Statesman, described them as the adults in the room. The FT reviewer went further, saying that if there were to be a new, quotes, committee to save the world, the authors of this book would be my top candidates for membership. One of the named authors, Prime Minister Gordon Brown, is not with us this evening, but we're delighted and indeed honored to have the other three authors here. To introduce them in the order in which they are sitting, starting from your left and working in from there, Mohamed El-Erian is well known to us in Cambridge as the president of Queen's College at the University of Cambridge. Since 2014, he served as the chief economic advisor at Allianz. He serves on 2 corporate boards and several advisory committees and non-profit boards. The list of other roles is long, so I will be selective and simply note that he is a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion, a contributing editor at the Financial Times, and a professor of practice at the Wharton School, the University of Pennsylvania. Mike Spence is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute, and Philip H. Knight, professor and dean emeritus at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. He was the chairman of an independent commission on growth and development. In 2001, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in economic science for his contribution to the analysis of markets with asymmetric information. Among the many accolades on his CV is the John Bates Clark Medal of the American Economic Association, awarded to economists under 40. And I pick out also, in this academic setting, where we are thinking about scholars funded to do their PhDs and master's studies at Cambridge, that he was elected a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1983, and was awarded the David A. Wells Prize for an outstanding doctoral dissertation at Harvard University in 1972. Reid Lidow served as executive officer to the Mayor of Los Angeles, and in that role provided strategic counsel to the mayor, as well as ensuring the execution of day-to-day goals. Reid was in that role during the coronavirus pandemic, and he led the writing team behind the mayor's nightly briefings. Reid has worked closely with Gordon Brown over an extended period on a range of initiatives, from encouraging countries to deliver an inclusive and quality education for all children to the Brexit campaign. Reid completed his undergraduate studies at the University of Southern California and then came to Cambridge on a Gates Scholarship in 2014 and earned an MPhil in Development Studies. In the preface to the new paperback edition of the book, not yet generally available, but advanced copies may be available later this evening, the authors exhort us to be hopeful. I'm now going to leave the floor to them to tell us what we could be hopeful about. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, and for your leadership of the Gates Cambridge Trust. And to you, Jim Smith, the entire Gates Cambridge team, what you've done here is extraordinary, so thank you. The doors you've opened, lives you've changed, mine included, and the work improving the lives of others that you have enabled. Thank you so, so much. Who am I? Why am I here? It was the 1992 vice presidential debate. Bill Clinton's running mate, Al Gore, is on stage alongside Dan Quayle. That was George H.W. Bush's vice president. There's also a third person up there, independent Ross Perot's running mate, a war hero, Congressional Medal of Honor recipient, and that's former Vice Admiral James Stockdale. Surrounded by career politicians and an unknown in the world of retail politics, Stockdale opened his remarks with those famous questions. Who am I? Why am I here? It's fitting tonight to ask that, as I'm joined by Michael Spence and Mohamed El-Erian. You've heard their bios from Eilish, and to not just work with them, but to learn from them has been a thrill. And to share a stage with them is surreal. This is the kind of opportunity I could only dream about as a Gates Cambridge Scholar first arriving on campus in 2014. I came here to CAM interested in development studies, questions exploring which economic levers countries can pull to lift themselves out of poverty. And at the Center for Development Studies just across the road, I soaked up all I could from my peers and instructors, renowned thinkers like Ha-Joon Chang, Peter Nolan, and Maha Abdul-Rahman. And it was after Cambridge in 2015, through USC's Vice Dean Stephen Lammy and his friend and colleague, the legendary speechwriter Bob Shrum, that I first met former Prime Minister Gordon Brown, who very much wishes he could be here tonight, but we've switched places. He's at my alma mater, USC, teaching a course, and I'm here. His work then, as it still does now, touched on so many of the issues I hope to inhabit. How do we deliver a quality and inclusive education for all, as promised in the Sustainable Development Goals? How do our Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and World Bank chief among them, retool and refocus for a new world order where deepening global problems must be met with global solutions? What is the UK's role in the world, not to mention the US's as a global anchor? From putting forward a positive case for Britain to lead and not leave the European Union, to working to expand educational access and opportunity, to offering a vision of hope, it has been a privilege to work alongside Gordon for nearly a decade. And that collaboration continued after I returned to Los Angeles to work for then Mayor, now U.S. Ambassador to India, Eric Garcetti. In the mayor's office, I started at the bottom of the comms team ladder. They gave me a quote for a press release, and I did that all right. So they gave me the press release, and that worked out. So they started giving me some speeches and made me deputy press secretary, and that's when I hit my stride. That was March 2020. Nothing major happened around then. It was the third Sunday in March. I was at my computer in the comm shop. It was clear we weren't going to be able to wish COVID away. The pandemic was at our doorstep. I was working on speechifying a draft ordinance, shutting down various aspects of the city, bars, parks, restaurants, you name it, and you're familiar with it. The mayor's legal counsel came over to my desk and asked if we were missing anything. I had heard a Big Lebowski reference earlier in the day, which was still rattling around in my head. For the uninitiated, that's a bowling-heavy movie. I pointed out bowling alleys were missing from the shutdown ordinance, and legal counsel hustled away saying, yes, bowling alleys, and proceeded to add that to the ordinance, much to the chagrin of bowlers, I'm sure. And that speech would become the first of close to 100 nightly briefings Mayor Garcetti gave to the people of Los Angeles. On that first night, we shut it all down. I was given the pencil, the keyboard, to lead the briefing team, to work with the mayor and his senior leadership to keep Angelenos informed. And I think it was in that moment that I went, aha, I'm finally making good on that Gates-Cambridge promise to improve the lives of others. It's not that my work on education or the campaign against Brexit or at the city surrounding various initiatives like homelessness or raising the minimum wage didn't improve lives. It certainly did to varying degrees with the team I was working with. But sometimes it's the fight you know you can't win, the one that knocks you down, or in the case of COVID, knocks all of us down, that leads to the most meaningful work. COVID messed with time horizons. It pulled things forward and pushed others back. Weddings, memorials, travel plans. It changed our lives and stole loved ones in the process. When the mayor was nominated by the Biden-Harris administration to be the next U.S. ambassador to India, we spoke about what was next for me. I'd always dreamed of running for office in Los Angeles. It was a local election year, and I felt I had something to contribute to the ordinarily unloved, unnoticed, idiosyncratic controller's race. The mayor's advice to me was simple. You run for office if you can't not do it. That's the Gates-Cambridge scholar curse, I suppose. We can't not take the plunge that might improve others' lives, developing that medicine or gene sequence, or research that will take us to the frontier of AI advances. Heck, that chili pepper that will bring us flavors and heat we've never tasted and felt before, and that's a true story. A scholar in my cohort developed a chili pepper that had something like 2 million Scoville units. So I ran for LA City Controller, and I got whooped. We won't talk too much about that, but what I will say are two things. First, long odds can make for incredible outcomes, even if that isn't victory. Jeff Bezos calls it the regret minimization framework. Imagine yourself in the future, and if you look back on your current decision, you need to be able to answer which option would lead to the least regret. For me, losing wouldn't lead to regret. Heck, it was the likely outcome and exactly what happened. But not taking the plunge, not putting myself out there in that zone of discomfort, all of that would have left me with regret. And my second point is this. People warn me running is like a drug. Once you run, if you don't win, you want to keep standing for office until you do win. Well, if running is a drug, it didn't take. Once is enough. There was a point at which the writing was on the wall that my campaign was going to fizzle. And I was still, as has been the case for years, talking to Gordon multiple times throughout the week. Midnight my time in LA, early his morning in the UK, me pacing throughout the house in the dead of night, laughing, formulating, plotting with Gordon, and driving my loved ones absolutely mad, because none of it was quiet. And it was on one of these calls late in the campaign that he encouraged me to join a book project with Mike and Mohamed exploring global crises. And we agreed if the campaign didn't pan out, that's what I'd do. And look, let's be real. Nobody here writes a book for the money. If you want to write for money, write ransom notes. You write because there's a story to tell. You write because you get to do it with folks like Mike and Mohamed. You write because you can't not do it. And I believe, we all believe, that the story in Permacrisis is an urgent one. It's a story about a world broken, but not beyond repair. It's a story of colliding catastrophes, of fractured growth, disjointed economic management, and outdated governance models. We don't need to mansplain the impacts to you. Anyone who has seen a heating or gas bill recently, a grocery bill, a medical bill, a rent bill, even a bill for a newspaper subscription, and then the headlines on that newspaper, understands our world is in crisis. That tech wars have led to trade wars that have led to a new Cold War, and that new Cold War could turn hot at any moment. That none of us would be surprised to see the disorderly operation of financial markets lead to accelerating corrections and crashes. That the countries with the means to do and give the most to those with the least, from vaccine delivery to climate change grants, will continue to defer those down payments and recurring payments. There were more 2 and 3 a.m. Zooms with Mike, Mohamed, and Gordon than I can possibly count. But our belief that a permacrisis does not need to become a permanent crisis kept us going. And we were fortunate to have an incredible team at Simon & Schuster, led by our fearless editor, Chris Doyle, as well as Johnny Geller at Curtis Brown, pushing us forward. And that brings us to the present day, today's paperback launch. Discussing these remarks with Gordon the other day, he pointed out that I should share a big idea with you, something on my mind, something that keeps me up at night. And we agreed that should be nationalism, a topic we've been carefully picking apart for a year. Nationalism is everything, everywhere, all at once, to echo the movie title. It's a multi-dimensional pandemic that we see borne out in headlines through economic protectionism, great power competition, and anti-immigrant xenophobia. In Permacrisis, nationalism is an uncredited actor lurking backstage in all of the scenes we lay out. Arresting today's slide toward nationalism is possible. Not someone known for his optimism, George Orwell said there's an antidote to nationalism, and that is a moral effort we all can make. Indeed, Orwell wrote that what makes nationalism so dangerous is that it is inseparable from the desire for power. In today's interdependent age, where our toughest challenges, from lingering inflation to climate emergencies, threaten all of us, I would submit that cooperation is the best antidote to nationalism. By giving up a little, we stand to gain a lot. That means working across borders. That means an end to the days of managing cooperation uncooperatively. And that means going out of our way to talk, just like we're doing today. So to bring it full circle and to return to Admiral Stockdale's words, that's me, that's who I am, that's why I'm here. At the start of every meeting with Mayor Garcetti, he would ask us to define the meeting parameters by answering the following question. This meeting will be successful if. For today, success is defined not just as the three of us talking amongst ourselves, telling you about the book, but breaking that fourth wall and all of us engaging in meaningful conversation. This year, it's really not the Gates-Cambridge Annual Lecture, but the Gates-Cambridge Annual Conversation. With that, we have a panel to get to and a conversation to start. So let's begin. Thank you. All right, so Mike, Mohamed, if you want to make some brief remarks, but also just talk a little bit. Let's tell the audience about the motivation to write Permacrisis. Mike? Hands on.
Does it? You can hear me? Okay. I don't have a mic, which is ironic because I'm the only person up here called Mike. I have lots of history with that one. Never mind. The motivation for doing this is really two things. One, a chance to work with my co-authors. I mean, that's very rare. We came together in the pandemic. We're friends. We respect each other. We learn a lot from each other. We knew we didn't agree on everything, so we had to work through, what if we tried to homogenize it down to everything we agreed on, it wouldn't have been that interesting, because the purpose of this book was to help people think about a very complicated situation. So that was part of the motivation. One of the things I enjoyed most, and this is a brief story, is, Reid did many things for this thing, made it accessible, made it look like there weren't one nerd, namely me, and some others writing, in different voices. But we wanted it to be accessible without oversimplifying. So the way this interaction would work is I would say something about a subject, like artificial intelligence, which I think is a part of the ongoing scenery. And Reid and I would together write it up, and with his help, it would be reasonably accessible. And then I would say to Reid, but that's not the whole story. And Reid would say, Mike, we don't need the whole story, not for this book. What we need is something that's thought-provoking. The other reason for reading it has to do with the substance. So the way I think about this, and I'll just be very brief, is like this. Mohamed wrote a book just before the great financial crisis called When Markets Collide. It was about, very powerful trends and things that were inconsistent with each other, crashing into each other. I think this is the same. So I think there's three sets of powerful forces. One, shocks of enormous frequency and magnitude being delivered by pandemics, wars, climate shocks, sometimes finance, etc., and then turbocharged by geopolitical tensions. So that's one set. That would be a fair amount to contend with. Second, there are some very powerful underlying trends in the way that the global economy is put together structurally, like aging in the parts of the global economy that produce most of its output, or disastrous-looking productivity growth trends, or pick anything you want. But the third is a trio of revolutionary scientific and technological transformations. The multi-dimensional, multi-decade digital one that everybody reads about, and another one in biomedical and life sciences that's transformational and intersects increasingly with the digital one. And then this massive energy transition that we have to go through to achieve. So when we were talking with each other, I thought, well, those things all happening at the same time and crashing into each other, because I got this from Mohamed, is producing, one, a very confusing and rapidly changing situation, two, an enormous amount of, high-speed structural change at a pace and scope that we hadn't seen for many, many years. So that was a second motivation. Can we write a book that doesn't solve all the problems, but just helps people orient themselves and understand and, maybe make less mistakes depending on what part of the world they inhabit. So that was the second motivation. Great co-authors and a challenging situation that maybe we could help people understand a bit better.
I never know what to add after Mike speaks. I think what kept us going is that we're all parents, kids in either teenagers or in their 20s. And we have a feel of being worried and guilty about the world that we're leaving them. A world that didn't pay enough attention to the planet. We now have a climate crisis. A world that has forgotten how to grow and grow in an inclusive manner. A world that is too highly indebted. A world that is too unequal. And we were worried. And a lot of the time we spent the first year was talking about our worries. And then we pivoted, we talked to Alish about this earlier, we pivoted from worried to worried but hopeful. And why did that pivot occur? Because as we talked about it, we realized that there was a reason why the world we live in has lost resilience, has lost human resilience, has lost financial resilience, has lost understanding for each other. And that reason had a lot to do with three developments. Development number one were impotent growth models. That the growth models that were being pursued did not deliver high, inclusive, and durable growth that is consistent with the realities of our planet. So we couldn't grow. And when you try to solve issues when you're not growing, it becomes really hard because you have to redistribute. And people feel marginalized, alienated, and you get a whole set of social problems. The second common problem is repeated policy mistakes. The same mistakes being made over and over again. And the more we look into it, it reflects the wrong mindsets. It reflects a failure to learn from good experiences elsewhere. And it reflects a failure to be open to alternative points of views. And then the third issue, and the most difficult, is the lack of global policy coordination in the face of global problems that are shared responsibility. So the hopeful part comes from there are engineering solutions to all this. On the growth side, this is not just anymore about being pushed out of bad growth models. You're being pulled now because of the three things Mike mentioned. Generative AI is changing not just what we do, how we do things. The transition to sustainable energy and what's happening in life sciences. So whether we like it or not, we've got to evolve our growth models. And there's hope because there are tools that can significantly increase our productivity. Policy mistakes, we hope that policymakers can learn from each other because there are some really good practices around the world that are not being shared. And then we hope, and that's where hope is different from optimism, to go back to some of it, to Alish, that the world can start collaborating again for that. So, that was the transition we went through. Started out really worried because we are parents and we're leaving our kids a really terrible world, to a hopeful world that this is actually a moment in time to get these things on a better track.
Connecting with that, something you said, Mike, as well, earlier on in the project, is that there are a lot of younger folks in here, a lot of Gates scholars, so this personally resonated, is that there's a generation or two that think the relative stability of the past 30 years is normal. That's just how it is. But we, in fact, have it wrong, have it backwards. That's the abnormal part, because massive injections of productive capacity, rapid growth in developing economies, the relative global stability that we had for 2 or 3 decades after, as the Soviet Union crumbled and then failed, and what came after, that's the abnormal part. The normal part is what we're getting now. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, what characterized that period, at least from a Western point of view, was this is when the emerging economies really grew. I mean, everybody knows about China. It's the biggest case, but it's certainly not the only one. In the course of that, there was just massive amounts of productive capacity that was previously essentially disconnected from the global economy, that became connected, much more productive, and so on. The supply side of the global economy, as a result, was enormously elastic. So if you had a demand surge, you'd get a temporary inflationary impulse, things that Mohamed knows better than I, but it would fade. That world doesn't look like the world we live in. The other part of it is, and I'm going to let Mohamed talk about this, is when you live that long in a period that had those unusual characteristics, very little inflation, supply side that basically, the demand side couldn't outrun, lots of young populations coming into the global economy. And then, after the great financial crisis, you had an economy that was demand constrained because of the balance sheet damage, and the central banks took the lead. Mohamed wrote the second major public, general kind of audience book called The Only Game in Town. That was the central banks. And in that decade, just think about this, we had almost zero nominal rates, negative real interest rates, and massive injections of liquidity into the system, and not a whiff of inflation. Not a whiff. Now, if any of you think that's normal, then we probably need to step outside and we'll have a little kind of conversation. It's just the coda of a very unusual period. And what we saw, I think correctly, is this was all changing pretty fast, and this is Mohamed repeatedly saying this, and the mindsets that policymakers, business people, finance types, and a whole lot of others went into this with were built for the past period and not the one we're entering. And this would probably lead to models that don't fit what's going to happen, missed forecasts, and lots of mistakes. And it isn't just policymakers, right? You know, last spring, about this time, maybe a little earlier, we had some major bank failures. So I find this an instructive case, and Mohamed discusses it very well. I don't know if you want to go there, but I think it would be instructive for the audience.
Why don't you go there? And then I'll supplement you, which is my role.
Okay. So Silicon Valley Bank essentially died overnight. Now, that was partly the social media era, when you can draw your money out in about 2 nanoseconds. But my bank, First Republic Bank, also failed. Mohamed says, banks have to manage various kinds of risk: interest rate risk, regulatory risk, credit risk. There's some others, but I can't remember them all. And then he says, and the simplest one, conceptually, is interest rate risk, right? Well, that's exactly what brought down these 2 banks. The balance sheets lost value because they had long-dated government treasury bonds sitting around, and the cost of funding went up, and the people lost confidence. And the only difference between that and the past is it happened faster. This is a classic example of the kind of mistake that gets made after a long period when you're confident the models, the mindset that you have about the world isn't challenged in a way that causes you to ask the question, is this really still, are these main parameters still valid? Or are we operating with something different? I don't know, is that what you had in mind?
That answer.
Let me add, there was this wonderful moment on Capitol Hill. They brought the CEOs of the failed banks in front of Congress, examining them. And they asked one of them, how could you slip on the most basic element of banking, which is matching your asset and your liabilities? And the answer is, because I believe the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
And then there was this moment, what do you mean you believe the Federal Reserve? So, well, the Federal Reserve told us in 2021 that inflation was transitory, that interest rates wouldn't need to go up. And I believed them. So I didn't need to match my long-dated liabilities because interest rates were going to come down. So go back in 2021. When inflation appeared, central banks immediately called it transitory because we had just been living in this period where there was insufficient demand. We had poured trillions of dollars into the economy, both from the monetary side and the fiscal side, and there was no inflation because there wasn't enough demand. So the inflation that was being seen with an old mindset led people to immediately dismiss it as transitory. Now, transitory is a really dangerous word. If I tell you something is transitory, it means it's temporary, it's reversible, it will take care of itself, you should look through it, meaning do nothing. So the Federal Reserve, then the Bank of England, then the ECB, starting in March of 2021, come up with it is transitory. And then inflation starts not only being stubborn, but going up and up and up. Comes the end of November, Chairman Powell, the chair of the Fed, is in front of Congress and says, his words, it's time to retire the word transitory from our vocabulary. You would think that if you retire the word, you would change the way you behave. This was November. In March, when the inflation print hit 7%, it ultimately went up above 9%. Interest rates were still 0. and liquidity was still being put into the system. The result of which, we had to hit the brakes really hard and had the most concentrated, front-loaded increase in interest rates. I say this because here's an example of mindsets. They weren't open to the possibility where we're changing paradigms. They just took the experience of the past and said it must be the same. And people forgot that what was different was what we lived after the global financial crisis. If I had been here in 2016 and said to you that 30% of debt in the world would trade at negative nominal yields, meaning you lend me your money, you take the risk of lending me your money, and then you pay me for lending me your money. You know how absurd that is? And yet 30% of government debt traded at negative yields. There wasn't a single economics book that allowed for that possibility. That is the artificial world we were in. And we somehow lose sight. And we have Lucia Reiche, who can tell you all the behavioral and the confirmation we get every day, that we just lose sight of how important it is to keep our minds open to different paradigms. And I think right now this is really important because, as Mike said, we are shifting paradigms. And it's one of these 80-20 equations, where 80% is upside, 20% is downside. And if you don't manage it well, that 20% can actually be really frightening.
What you're describing, as you've said, is not one data point, it's a pattern of behavior. And so you've talked a bit about how the Fed, and this is relevant for other central banks, has become excessively data dependent. We're still in a tough inflationary environment, but it's being called the last mile. How long is the last mile in the inflation fight?
Yeah, I mean, there was a wonderful cartoon in one of the newspapers where the chairman is holding up a kite. And the kite has written on it interest rates. And the notion is the view of interest rates shifts with the winds. And in particular, shifts with the latest data release. Now, most economists will tell you high-frequency data is incredibly volatile. It is a combination of signal and noise. So the last thing you want to be is excessively data dependent. Because if you're excessively data dependent, then you will mistake noise for signals, and you're going to have to change your mind. And instead of being an anchor of stability, if you're a central bank, you become a contributor to volatility, which is not your role. But that's what has happened. If you want a simpler analogy, when my daughter went to boarding school, the head of the school, the principal, the headmaster, spoke to the parents and said, let me tell you what's going to happen. You're going to get a phone call in the next few days telling you your kid loves the school, loves his or her friends, loves the food, loves his or her roommate. And then a week later, you're going to get another phone call, and your kid's going to tell you they hate all this. And then they're going to put the phone down, and you're going to be in an absolute panic, and your child will forget what they just told you and is going to have fun. Your child is about to go on an emotional roller coaster. Your job is not to get on the roller coaster. Your job is to stay on the side and wave and be the anchor for them. And we have a situation now with excessive data dependency that our policymakers are on the roller coaster. And not only that, they have the accelerator. They turbocharge the way up and they turbocharge the way down. And that has become, now, why are they there? Because back in 2021, they took a strategic view that turned out to be completely wrong, that embarrassed them, that undermined their credibility, and now they're terrified of taking another strategic view. But the lesson of making a mistake is not you then go and make another mistake, is you try to learn. I say this because the second element that comes up over and over again is lack of openness. It's the lack of cognitive diversity. And that has to do with two things. One has to do with the fact that the decision-making bodies are not diverse enough, whether it's gender, culture, experience. And the other thing is that certain decision-making bodies, like the Federal Reserve, will not bring in outsiders. At least the Bank of England brings in independent members, outsiders. And if you don't bring outsiders, you completely change the equation. Everybody will agree with the chair. But if the chair doesn't know where they want to go, you'll end up with the process we ended up now, which is accentuating volatility, which tend to hurt the most vulnerable segments of our society particularly hard, because they do not have the resilience that you need in a world that becomes more volatile.
And connecting with something you said, Mike, a couple months ago, so the publisher comes to us and they say, all right, it's time for the paperback. You know, these things fall at certain intervals, and so we're writing again. And you know, the point you made was what we're seeing in the world isn't undermining our thesis, it's reinforcing it. Just look at the past week or so, waves on the tarmac at Dubai airport under Emirates planes. You know, we have tensions rising in the Middle East. We have inflation in the US at least still stubbornly above 3%. Fights ongoing now currently over TikTok in the US and a looming ban there. So can you just talk a little bit, Mike, about, you know, how you see all these things coming together, reinforcing the permacrisis thesis?
Well, there's both positive and negative elements of it. So I think there's nothing, when Reid and I were talking, that seems to, you know, make me wish we'd written something else. You know, let's call it a war in the Middle East. You know, there's been no let up in climate shocks. They're pretty much global, and they're big enough to be macroeconomically significant events at this point. There's no really significant diminution in the geopolitical tensions vis-a-vis China and the United States. You could quibble with that. The two presidents have talked to each other. There's a number of cabinet secretaries, you know, going back and forth to try to contain the, you know, economic impact of national security-driven restrictions. And the one that that caught my attention was actually in Mohamed's territory, and that is, I think at the end of last year, the markets, the financial markets were discounting, meaning betting, on something like 4 to 6, 7, you know, 1/4 of a percentage point interest rate reductions, and I thought, that's just nuts. I mean, if we're right, and there's supply constraints lurking in the background, even when you get the demand side under control, you know, if you kind of let up, and 6 or 7 would have put the real interest rate back near zero, even if you're at the 2% target. So I wrote something about that. Fortunately, when I write anything about macroeconomics, nobody pays any attention because I don't know what I'm talking about. But in this case, I felt, you know, that's an example of what we were after in the book, is, you know, trying to look, you know, at the underlying structure that we're living in. So that's my current favorite example. So I still think we're right. On the positive side, I mean, we'll probably talk about it in a bit, but I do think the Gen AI, sequence of breakthroughs in AI, with special emphasis on image recognition, you know, object recognition, which came in the 2015 area, and now the Gen AI, which is, I won't try to describe it right now. I think it is a huge positive shock if handled properly. That is it. We have written this. I don't think we disagree on this. The potential to produce a huge positive, extended, sustained surge in productivity in a world that's aging, has high debt, is probably going to have to invest 3 to 4 trillion in climate adaptation, and I mean change, mitigation. You know, it looks like not only, I guess the way we say it is, not only is the potential there, but it's awfully well timed in a supply constrained world. And so, and it doesn't look like it's going to fade away. I know that valuations are a bit nutty right now and everybody's chasing it, but this is not the right time to sit on the sidelines. It's not the right time to assume it's just a fad and it will go away. But you can hear a range of views on that. I'll admit I'm on the positive end of the spectrum. So the notion that this is a world that fits the title of the book, I think, is held up pretty well.
By the way, when he said not time sit on the sideline, he wasn't giving investment advice. He is not telling go and buy NVIDIA.
Right.
What he's saying is
By Cisco. No, kidding.
I mean, take this seriously. This is a major transformation. There's a paper that he and a friend of ours, Jim Menica, wrote on the productivity potential. And Mike always stresses the word potential because there's nothing automatic about it happening. It needs to be turned from potential into reality. But it is really important, and it can help us on the supply side. I realized I didn't answer your question on inflation, but this is another really obvious thing that people lost sight of. And this is a US problem more than anywhere else. And where the debate is fascinating to me. So people recognize now that inflation has gotten sticky, that it's not easy to bring it down to the 2% target. So they call it the last mile, and it's going to be a really bumpy last mile. And the reason is very simple, because there's goods inflation and service inflation. And goods inflation was negative. So goods inflation being negative brought down the overall inflation rate, while service inflation stayed high. Now, you can't have falling prices forever. So now goods inflation is turning positive, while service inflation is still too high. So if you want to come down to 2%, you have to crush service inflation. Service inflation is less sensitive to the interest rate tool. So you basically have to push the economy into a major recession. Now, the debate should be, is 2% the right target for the world we live in? Where did 2% come from? Was it the result of some complex model? Was it the result of some scientific analysis? No, it was totally arbitrary. It's the Bank of New Zealand in 1991 that was experimenting with inflation targeting. It decided to take 2% because it was above zero, so you don't get stuck too low, but it wasn't high enough to scare anybody. So it anchored inflation expectations. So they tried 2%. And then we had this period, as Mike said, where inflation wasn't a problem. So 2% seems sensible because we never got to 2%. And the next thing we know, the ECB adopts it, the Bank of England adopts it, the Federal Reserve adopts it. It's as if I tell you that regardless of our initial conditions, we should all have the same weight target. Now, if the weight target is at 400 kilograms, we can live with that. But when you go from a world of insufficient demand to a world of insufficient supply, suddenly it really matters what your target is. But try to have this conversation with any central bank in the open. Behind closed door, they'll have it. In the open, no one's having it. Why? Because they've missed the inflation target by so much for so long that they're worried about their credibility. But think of the absurdity that we may end up in trying to get to a target that is no longer appropriate for the world we live in. Again, that shows you that you make one mistake and then you're so far away from the world of first best that you're likely to make another mistake and another mistake. So first we had the transitory inflation mistake. Then we had the banking crisis mistake because they believed the transitory inflation story. And now, if we're not careful, we may end up pushing the US into recession because we're not willing to talk about the inflation target. And that shows you how these repeated policy mistakes end up making our world more vulnerable. And now we don't need to do this. These are things that can be fixed. But you need to be able to talk about it openly. And that's one thing we really encourage in the book.
And editorial note, this is in the book as well, very directly saying that a neutral rate at an arbitrary point of 2%, it ought to be closer to 3%. So the courageous leap was made there. This isn't Monday morning quarterbacking the book. It is in print. Just connecting with that, though, moving quickly, Mohamed, from the US to the UK. You've talked about the UK being in a situation where we have low growth, high inequality, high debt. And the challenge for the UK here to solve is adopting, hard as this may be, a developing country mindset. What does that look like? Tell us a bit about that.
Yes, so the advanced country mindset is cyclical. We go through cycles, and if you're really good, which somehow the world believed after Volcker and anything else, you can actually manage the cycle really well. The developing country mindset is very different. It is structural. Your structure is changing. That's what development is all about. There are phases. You do things differently. Your institutions have to change. It's a little bit like being an adult or a teenager. An adult, you're relatively stable. You have ups and downs. A teenager, you're becoming an adult, and things change. And it's taken a very long time for the political elites in the advanced countries to be willing to talk about structural issues. Now we are talking about it. Every political party here talks about the need for growth. Every political party here talks about productivity, how we have to do things differently to boost productivity. So it's happening, but it's not happening at the speed that it needs to happen. And I'm going to hand over to Mike, because Mike has spent a lot of time looking at growth. And he had something really interesting in a talk earlier today that Lucia organized, when he said something very striking. He said that, and I'm going to put words in your mouth, but he said that when people talk about growth, you try to understand what growth model, what framework do they have in their head when they talk about growth outcomes, stroke issue. And you said, it wouldn't surprise me if there's as many growth models in people's head as there are people talking about growth. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so it's a hobby of mine. We were talking about behavioral economics. But, having spent a lot of time in the world that Mohamed just described, in developing countries, where growth and structural change are essentially the same thing. And you can see it because they grow, the successful ones, at very high rates. We're talking sustained, quarter century growth rates of 6 and 7%. At 7%, you're doubling the size of whatever it is every decade, right? So this is, it's chaotic, but it's transformational. And so it's a little harder to see, except in extraordinary periods like this in the developed economies. But what I've noticed over time, this is maybe kind of about mindsets and whatnot, is people talk about growth, but for anybody who spent some time thinking about it, and there's very good literature. I mean, Robert Solow created kind of modern version of growth theory. There's endogenous growth theory in economics. There's Schumpeter from the past that's still valid today about how this works, or what the financial side of the incentives are. I still believe human beings innovate in part just because they love innovating as opposed to make a lot of money. But that's a behavioral assumption. But what I was saying to Lucilla and her colleagues and Mohamed earlier today is, when people talk about growth in the developed world, they don't sound like they know what they're talking about. I mean, there's nothing that makes any sense that lies underneath it. One person, let's call her Liz Truss, thinks if you cut taxes enough, things will start to grow. There's no distinguish between demand and supply constrained growth. Some people think it's all entrepreneurship and whatnot. It's just, you see what I mean? I mean, it's a complicated process that involves structural change. And, there are people who sort of seriously understand it. And there are countries that have learned to understand it. And so anyway, I think one of the roadblocks to having sensible conversations about the things, some of the things we've tried to talk about, is that the starting point's pretty weak in terms of kind of basic understanding. Now, I think that may change over time in the positive direction, not just because of the book, but because people are going to be forced to think about it. You know, if you believe that artificial intelligence or these other technological transformations are going to have a major impact, you know, somebody's going to have to explain why, right? What's the mechanism, not, you know, that drops down from heaven. So I think that's kind of where we are. It's a Mohammed's right. If you live in a demand constrained world, nothing much changes, and you know, the productivity is growing slowly. The structure isn't changing very much, and there's a few cyclical fluctuations. It creates a mindset that takes you away from what's going on now. Technological change, big, you know, structural changes in anticipation in the economy. So we're all going to have to struggle with that. I mean, that's not simple. Snap your fingers.
Let's move here, and we're going to go to Q&A in a second, but let's move from a growth mindset for a moment to a management mindset. You both were writing in Project Syndicate earlier this month, talking about the importance of India's rise, using China as an example, and with the idea that it's never too early to manage one's own rise, particularly when you're a systemically critical country like India, a core stakeholder in the present global conditions and the future of the globe as well. What does that responsibly look like?
Let me just say one great thing about having a Nobel Prize winner as a friend. Okay, is he'll say something to you that for him is totally natural. And you think, whoa, wow, I had never thought of that. And I don't know, we were on a phone call, weren't we?
Yeah.
We were on a phone call, and he had just come back from India. And he had spent time looking at India's climate challenge and everything else and what's happening in India and everything. And then we started having this conversation that reminded me of the same conversation that he and I had about China 15 years earlier.
That was a crucial thing, yeah.
15 years earlier, we had that. When I said to him, China isn't taking its global responsibility seriously. It's the second largest economy in the world. And he looked at me and said, that's not how they think about it in China. In China, they think about it as they're the 70th per capita income. And before they take on global responsibility, they must complete the domestic responsibility. And of course, the element here I'm going to hand over to Mike is that we have two countries that are so large that, as Mike says, they become systemically important at a relatively low level of income. And if you don't want countries, think of Facebook, think of Google. The people, the leaders there, believed that they were changing the world for the better. They were so focused on what they were doing that they didn't realize they had become systemically important until we saw the ugly side of what they had enabled, starting with the elections in the US in 2016. So it was this notion of, will India fall into the trap of Facebook, China, or will India be able to manage its systemic importance?
Absolutely.
Professor Spence.
Yeah, I think we focused on that originally because of China. We were, Mohamed actually, with one of his colleagues then at PIMCO, wrote a paper, a widely ignored paper in China that basically said this, you know, you are becoming very important. What systemically important means you have big impacts on everybody else. And it's happening at a relatively low level of per capita income. And you quite naturally want to stick with this very complex domestic agenda, but it's not a good idea. It's better to start doing this balancing act. And they ignored that advice. And that it was delivered from multiple sources, but I remember your paper well. I delivered it verbally, and they said, well, that's not interesting. We'll do that later. And the consequence of that is that they traipse down this path, turning in stellar economic performance. I mean, we're talking, 8-9% growth rates coming into the 2000 teens. But they were this is a technical term, pissing a lot of people off, okay? Without really paying attention to the kind of impact that they were having on employment elsewhere, on how their subsidies were affecting everybody. And so but we basically wrote this short paper saying the tech sector kind of made this mistake and got around to this late. China looks like it did late, having done a lot of things right. But India should try not to. And I think, you could make the case that India's, at least in some dimensions, taking this seriously. I mean, Prime Minister Modi is been pretty skillful in a complex world in navigating between the Western powers and China and Russia, which is a longtime trading partner of theirs. But India's record in other dimensions is mixed. So, for example, the world's global supply chains are diversifying because that's what you need to do to have resilience. That didn't happen before. Global supply chains used to be built on efficiency and comparative advantage and literally almost nothing else. But the shocks have forced this away, and it's being reinforced by policy. So Apple now has 15% of their iPhone assembly in India. So India looks like they're going to, get the baton handed to them from China. But then they have a bunch of kind of domestically hard to read protectionist stuff and foreign direct investments falling. So even there's sort of a mixed picture about how they're going to engage with the rest of the world. I find this stuff fascinating, but it's economically and in other ways sort of first order consequential.
It's all linked, though, and this goes back to the point in the opening remarks to a certain extent about nationalism, and we see this as 49% of the world's going to the polls this year. The consequences are, we see them in where our iPhones are assembled, where chips are manufactured with friendshoring, reshoring, ally shoring, all the different shorings under new banners now.
Yep.
To what extent, but industrial policy isn't all blanket statement bad. There's some good here. Where do we see the fine line?
Let me also we see nationalism in thousands of innocent civilians losing their lives and their livelihoods. I mean, this is really consequential. We don't think industrial policy is a bad word. In fact, we think that without industrial policy, smart industrial policy, we're not going to be able to unleash these potential productivity gains. And one concern that you would have about Europe is that this has to be done at the pan-European level. So you have the US, you have China, and then you have Europe here that is yet to kick this up to a pan-European level for all sorts of long-standing reasons. But it has to be done at that level, right, Mike?
Yes, but you can't. Yes, briefly, when I'm talking to my European, Mario Draghi is on this, right? He's working for the European Commission, sort of trying to make the case that you don't have to fiscally centralize Europe, but if you want to efficiently make the big investments in tech, in cloud computing, in science and whatnot that drives long-term structural change, by far the best way to do it is to fund it and administer it centrally. So the Europeans, when I talk to them, especially in Italy where I live, they kind of look at me puzzled. And I said, look, the United States has the National Institutes of Health. That's $40 billion a year. That's life sciences. And we have the National Science Foundation that Vannevar Bush created. And we have the Energy Department, just massive amounts of centrally funded and centrally administered. We don't care if a fair share goes to Tennessee or Oklahoma. But if we were operating like Europe, we'd take the federal government out of the business of doing this. And we'd say, we'll let California, Texas, New York, and Massachusetts take care of it. And what do you think would happen? We'd underinvest, and we'd invest in our own local folks, even if that's not what the meritocracy says we should do, so to be inefficient as well. That's the kind of roundabout way of explaining why it's so important for long-term growth and structural change in Europe is to make these investments. And just to make it personal, my view, in Italy, which has grown, this is a quiz, how much since the euro was introduced in total? Anybody? Zero. So we need this more than anybody else. Our most important and valuable export is the most creative young people in the country. This is a disaster. What's going to keep them? A vibrant entrepreneurial community, funding for their research, et cetera. The kinds of things. I admit this is an extreme case, but there is a tendency to sort of say, well, the fiscal constraints won't let us do this. So I apologize for preaching, but on this one, I really feel strongly. If you fail the most creative young people in your orbit, you're making the most important failure you can make.
And with that, we enter phase 3 here of the conversation, which is the conversation with you all. So we'll open it up here to Q&A.
So we're opening up now to Q&A. We have 2 people with roving microphones, or we have 2 microphones and 1 person.
Right up front.
And we have a question here in the front row to begin with.
You have an excellent prop there. Yes.
Yeah? All right. Hi, my name is Albert. I'm a first-year Gates Scholar working on one of the crises, climate crisis in the cold areas of the world. And I was wondering, because in this talk we heard a lot about finance, economics, and also, I must admit, I didn't read the book yet, but I have a copy here. And section 1 is on growth, section 2 is on economic management. And I wondered if your approach in the book with regards to the climate crisis is basically one of sustainable green growth, and how you would, if that is the case, respond to criticisms from people who say that over the last couple of years hasn't really turned into major emissions mitigations, and that maybe a different strategy would be needed to tackle the climate crisis.
That's in fact addressed in the book. You want to talk about?
Yeah, I know we're not going fast enough, but I actually think the premise is wrong. So, but with a disastrous starting point. So the United States used to be at 20 tons per person, metric tons per person. We're down to 15. I know we have a long way to go. Europe's, carbon intensity of the economy measured as how much carbon you produce per euro of output is declining at 2% a year. Again, not fast enough, but major progress. China is a powerhouse now in, green technology. And it is projected to peak before its target at 2030. Now, it's by far the largest source of carbon. I'm telling you stuff you already know. But if they peak and it starts to come down very quickly, then I think, people will gain a sense of a little bit of hope, even though they know we're late and we'll probably miss the 1.5 degree Celsius targets in the interim, but just because we're so late. I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine. And I'm at times a vocal skeptic. So in the Indian context, although I don't think I did it in the paper, maybe I did. This is our article we wrote. India is projected to peak in 2035. My bet is they're growing at 7% at that year. If your carbon emissions peak when you're growing at 7% a year, your carbon intensity is going down at 7% a year. That's just arithmetic, okay? That's never happened anywhere, okay? So something pretty dramatic is going to happen. So if you're skeptical, kind of about a first best solution on mitigation, I agree with you. We all spend a fair amount of time staring at these numbers. The reason I'm skeptical about India is if they peak, given the growth rates they're going to have in 2035, they're going to peak at 3.8 tons per person, which has never happened. I mean, even close in a high growth developing economy. So what's the conclusion? There's lots of uncertainty, but by way of summary, sustainability is part of the growth story, either the success or the failure. In fact, it's a growth strategy.
So let me extend Albert's
Go ahead.
question.
Yeah.
Because, sorry, Albert, I'm going to put words in your mouth. Why even target growth? Forget about growth. Growth is bad for the planet. And you've heard that argument, and we addressed that issue in the book.
I know you know the answer to this.
No, go ahead.
So in parts of Europe, there's a thing called the slow food movement. Basically, it's anti-growth. And it makes a lot of sense. I am very sympathetic to the people who promote this, right? But it's parochial. So the no-growth idea, in a world that, where it's reasonable to question, do we really need another washing machine or a fancier car or something, is fine. But you wouldn't want to ask that question in rural India, for sure. So it's a way of ducking the main problem. And the main problem is there's a lot of people whose aspirations depend on growth to achieve them. And we have to respect those aspirations. And that's what makes the magnitude of the change in the growth model in the direction of sustainability as big a challenge as it is. So that's where we are. Sure, if all of a sudden growth went away, or everybody started growing at 1.5%, which is kind of a vague area in which the advanced countries have been growing now with poor productivity growth, fine. I mean, the other thing that Mohamed and I talk about a lot is the following. If we're going to invest $3, $4, $5 trillion a year incrementally in the energy transition, it's very hard to see how we're going to pull that off in a low growth, high real interest rate, highly indebted economy that we've dug ourselves a hole into. And so to us, all of these things come together. If we're going to be able to afford to do that and deal with the distributional issues that have become inequality, that have become severe, it's very hard to pull it off. If you tell somebody we're going to solve our inequality problem in a no-growth environment, what that means is some people are going to lose and other people are going to gain. In a high-growth environment, which is the kind of thing you see in a developing country, you can solve the inequality problem just having the growth be a little higher at the lower end of the spectrum. So there's a lot of reasons, I think, that we tried to bring together in the book that suggest there's a pathway forward that has all these components.
So I'm going to take a couple or maybe 3 questions from the floor and then leave it to the panelists to decide how to answer them. If we cluster them together, then we'll have more chance to use more questions. So, Ella, as the first one, and then if 2 other people, come to you, and a third one, So,
Hi, thank you. My name is Della. I'm a 3rd, 4th year Gates Cambridge Scholar and the Vice President of the Gates Council. I've been listening to you and my mind kept wandering. Where is race and gender in moving towards solving the problems we have today? My mind is specifically going to the fact that I came to the UK and I realized that because clothes are made in the global south, they are very cheap to afford here in the UK because the earning is way above where the clothes are made. And then I also think about things like, if you take the African continent, the African continent haven't done massive industrialization, so their contribution to the climate change crisis isn't as huge as other continents, but they are having to bear the consequences, and yet profits made from all that industrialization elsewhere isn't shared with Africa. I mean, let's not count the little charities here and there. But when we are thinking about who sits at the decision table at the global level to make these economic decisions, so many leaders from the global south are missing. So I am thinking, how important is race and gender to solving the crisis? Is it even important, or whoever sits at the decision-making table and makes the right decisions will get us there? Or we really have to think about making sure that the decision table is diversified enough? Thank you.
Thank you, Dilla. So hold that multifaceted question while we take two other short questions that our panel can then respond to.
Looking at the esteemed panel, I wouldn't automatically assume that a dour Scottish Labour ex-Prime Minister would be an automatic book fellow with you. What challenging perspectives did Gordon Brown bring to your thinking?
Okay, and then we have a third question. Yeah. You.
Hi, I'm Stan. I'm a first-year Gates Scholar studying astrophysics, so not related to this. But I think another question that you guys didn't address head-on, but you discussed, is the idea of kind of a heightened social media age and the heightenedness of communication and these kind of platforms. And when we're talking about shocks, and especially the finance systems and these kinds of things, I mean, we saw the S&P drop just because the rate cut didn't come down, right? The Chairman Powell had a soundbite, right? And these kinds of things, and then these kind of shocks are amplified when you have social media and you have kind of a rewiring of the way we think, right? Jonathan Haidt speaks a lot about this, and kind of was curious about whether this is a systemic cause that you have to address head on, or whether this will be fixed with kind of addressing, I mean, global economies and growth models. But yeah, just kind of how do you really see that as looping into the knot that is the permacrisis?
Okay, so your challenge in responding to those three very rich questions is that I do want to draw things to a close by 6:45, but there will be more time afterwards for those who want to stay and have a drink. So there will be time to explore the pits you can't quite cover, but over to you to address those three great questions.
30 seconds each. No, go ahead.
Okay, on Della's question first, and it's nice to meet you. This is in the book, so I'll be brief and to the point. But the premise of your question is spot on, which is, you know, if we do what we've always done, we'll get what we've always got. So certainly expanded diversity at decision-making tables is extremely important. Mohamed made this point earlier with respect to who's in FOMC committee meeting, where we're determining key economic policy. I come from state and local politics, so my state and local view of this is engaging with union labor. And there's an expression for this, which is, you know, you're using the table as a metaphor. If you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. And so the job is continually to push the boundaries of who's at the table and to challenge conceptions about what kind of individuals expect or think they're entitled to be at the table. So that's critically important. And we take that beyond elected politics. We look as well at the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, where a lot of these global public goods are going to need to be funded, and talk about the kind of funding mechanisms that will need to be present there, as well as the cognitive shifts, which will need to come with a new generation of people walking in those halls in DC and elsewhere. So hope that Reader's Digest version's okay. Thank you. Then
I'll just add one thing to that. You know, I believe, having studied development and growth in the post-war period, that it's very hard, especially in the early days when you're relatively poor, but that a world that's fragmenting in terms of the global economy, which is where one of the most important growth levers is, and a world that's delivering this many shocks, particularly on the climate front, is essentially a perfect storm. And so I would add to what Reid just said, that in this context, although, you know, there's a great big domestic agenda that young leaders in Africa and other places are going to need to shoulder in order to pull this off, they need external help. You know, the pandemic took away most of their fiscal resources that would normally be used for the public sector side of investment. You know, the health effects were enormous. So they've lost maneuverability and resources. And I think the commitment to, well, there's $100 billion commitment that hasn't been delivered to help buffer the shocks coming from climate. It has to be delivered, and it probably needs to be larger. So I just think what are called the low-income countries, which are really just countries that were late starters in the growth and development process, just need a whole lot of help. And I wouldn't have said that 25 years ago in a calmer, environment where lots of people have argued if you have excessive external financing and interference, you're basically doing more harm than good. We've rounded a corner on that, from my point of view. I'm going to leave Gordon Brown to you. Well, I loved working with Gordon Brown. Well, let's both do that. Okay, so what Gordon brought to this is, a really passionate concern about the way the global economy, our interdependence is put together, and how it's fragmenting under the forces of nationalism, and I would call unipolarity, meaning how do I say it? Unilateral actions. I don't care what the World Trade Organization said. This decision is inconvenient, and I'm going to ignore it. The United States has done that. China's done it. Everybody, it's gotten to be a habit, and it hurts. The WTO is just an example. And I think Gordon has not only thought a lot about this, but he's devoted his post-prime ministerial life to trying to make these institutions work, in education, in health, and so on. And I think that part of the book, which was led by him, is deserving of the consideration that it's getting. On the social media, I think there's two issues. One is whether they're actually kind of a bad news in terms of the kind of political processes and so on. I mean, I think we're within an ace of shutting TikTok down in the United States. This is a big deal. First of all, there'll be a revolt among the young people. Second, I think it's become the biggest advertising platform, sort of passing Meta and Google. So it'll be a bit of an earthquake. So this is why are we going to do that? Part of there's two reasons, as is always true in these kind of industrial policy cases. One is the fear that it has adverse effects on the young people who use it so much. But the other one is we're scared of China, right? And this TikTok is a subsidiary of a Chinese company called ByteDance, which I happen to have an indirect investment in, so I'm not enthusiastic about this shutdown. But so I think we've got the issues that are related to security, national security, security of data. What is China really doing with this data and whatnot? And they have similar concerns about us. So this is symmetrical. And then we've got these kind of, impacts on kids. And then there's this volatility issue, right? When Silicon Valley Bank failed, what happened is that Peter Thiel sent out a note that went viral on one of the social media saying, the bank's gone, and within literally minutes, because of the way Silicon Valley people operate, the money was flowing out of Silicon Valley Bank at a rate that, just brought it to its knees, essentially instantaneously. I think we're going to see more of that. The last thing I'll say, which you didn't ask, is you can build architectures that protect yourselves from this. So one of the things that we didn't talk about, and it fits under Mohamed's learning from each other, is when I was in India, I investigated with help from some of the architects the sort of digital financial system in India. India has a pretty vibrant digital economy now, third largest source of unicorns, doubled by adding 400 million, mobile internet users. But the really impressive thing is the way they have put together, the digital payment system. Now, I'm not going to go into it, but it's worth investigating. This is an example, I think, where the rest of the world, if we weren't so concentrated on what we're doing at home, would go and look. And to go back to Africa, when India hosted the G20 this last year, there was sufficient interest in precisely this, a sustainable version of microfinance based on a really well-architected digital payment system, that India agreed to essentially export it, which means to deliver not only the architecture, not the infrastructure, you can't do that, but the architecture and the code that underpins this. And I think if that happens, it could be quite transformative. It is really beautifully put together. There's no data monopolies. The payments clear instantly for anybody who's sort of joined it. The government delivers a lot of money to poor people in the rural areas. They used to go through intermediaries, and roughly 40% of it disappeared on that trip. Now it goes directly into the bank account or the wallet. And this whole thing is underpinned by the biometric digital identification system that Nanda Nilekani created. So it's just a stunning performance. And I think that's one of the reasons I get optimistic. You never know where one of these is going to come from, but it's pretty impressive.
So, Mohamed, I know you're on a very tight schedule, so I can either dispense with giving you the last word or give you 1 minute.
Completely up to you.
1 minute.
You have the last word.
Okay, so start Gordon Brown, Africa. We try to solve at the intersection of economic rigor, public policy, where there's no one that I've come across that cares as much as public policy and lives it and is passionate as Gordon, and then private sector issues, market issues, and Gordon brought that. And if Gordon were here, he would have taken a geopolitical angle to a lot of our conversation. He would have said he's worried about the world fragmenting. He's worried about Africa being left behind in this fragmentation, that Africa will not be able to be the swing state that an India can be, that a Saudi Arabia can be, and Africa will be forced into choices that it shouldn't be allowed to make. And then he would come back on your governance issue, and he would tell you the reason why we spend so much time on the reform of the IMF and the World Bank is because of Western hypocrisy. So these institutions go out and advocate for merit-based, and yet the head of the IMF has to be European, and the head of the World Bank has to be American. And he will say that the reaction of the rest of the world is to disengage. And he would point to the different institutions. And if you like an image, these are little pipes that are being built around these multilateral institutions that fragments the world more, which ends up with the social media question. This person here won the Nobel Prize for work in the 70s about asymmetrical information and what asymmetrical information does to markets and market efficiency. And what social media does is it massively increases asymmetrical information. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohamed, and that's a great place to stop. And you'll forgive me if I don't do a wrap-up that does justice to everything that's been said, because it was so rich. I will use the excuse of the fact that there are some nervous new fellows at Queen's waiting to be inducted in the chapel, and if the president doesn't get there, they won't get their ceremony. So simply to thank our panelists for a rich and fascinating conversation. Thank you.